In the 1980s, disaster struck the world's haemophilia community. Thousands of people around the globe contracted HIV and AIDS from contaminated blood products. The story behind the contamination is still emerging, in the unlikeliest of places. The Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, for one.
Angola was a murder field. Had murders every day, killings every day. You had to walk around with trench coats on with knives on you. Had to sleep with your knife in your hand under your pillow and one eye open, so to speak.
Another unlikely place is Skid Row, Los Angeles. For hundreds of street people in this city, this is home.
I walk around the corner to the plasma center, I donate my blood, sick or not really caring. I just needed that fix money.
But I know they can see the fresh needle marks, but they were getting what they wanted. They wanted the blood.
Blood was sought from donors who were later to pose the highest possible risk for HIV.
If the companies had done what we recommended, and indeed kept the material that was collected from high-risk donors out of the market forever, we would have saved probably half the hemophiliacs.
Haemophilia is a rare blood condition which mainly affects boys. It's a genetic disorder, but in a third of all cases, there's no previous family history. It just strikes out of the blue. That's what happened to John Scallon, who was born in Wexford in 1960.
It wasn't something people looked for because haemophilia was relatively rare. When he was a little bit older and he had started having these enormous bruise-type swellings and contusions, they began to investigate, and he had a blood test. And a haematologist at the time discovered that he actually had a factor VIII deficiency, and this was haemophilia.
But John also experienced a lot of pain as a child. Cuts and grazes weren't the real problem. Friction in joints could cause profuse internal bleeding. This could lead to severe arthritis and other long-term damage.
He spent a lot of time in his childhood not able to walk because of joint bleeds. He had a little sort of a trolley thing on wheels that he used to scooch around on, as I say, in Wexford, and push himself along just to get himself maybe to the toilet. And then as he got a bit older, he got onto crutches. If he had a bleeding, say, at the back of his eyes, he was once blind for a few days at a time. If he had an abdominal bleeding where you could see nothing except pain and swelling, and it was extremely difficult for doctors to know whether that was appendicitis or an internal bleed.
In the early 1960s, treatment for haemophiliacs was quite limited. Bad bleeds needed to be treated with whole blood transfusions. If things got bad for John, he'd be rushed from Wexford to a hospital in Dublin.
In a way, it was a treat to go to Dublin with John and Dad driving the car, and it would be a race to Dublin. It would be a fast drive to Dublin. And I remember my father explaining to me what happened, pointing at the telephone wires on the road to Dublin, saying, you know, Mum was on the phone to the hospital in Dublin and she's going to have doctors ready to have John better when we get there. And it might be the last you see of John for 2 or 3 weeks or more, because it could be a bad bleed and he'd be in for treatment.
He never said, why me? He had a philosophy where he would maybe get terribly annoyed about it or very cross because he was missing something. But he didn't really ever complain. He perhaps he resented a little bit what his brothers and sisters could do, but his way of dealing with that was bossing them around and getting them to wait on him. And he had all his life an extraordinary charm and ability to get something out of people. That's the way he was, and he used it.
"6,000 miles away, Los Angeles, California, home to another severe haemophiliac who, like John Scallon, knew all about pain from an early age.
Well, I think given that my youth was 50s and early 60s, it was difficult treatment was long. Trips to the emergency rooms were multiple each week, and bleeds were common, and the limitations were rather high, and the pain was constant. I don't remember ever having a day without pain.
In the late 1960s, a new drug designed to control hemophiliac bleeds was being tested in LA.
My right ankle had been bleeding pretty profusely, and nothing was working. My father had known the then president of Highland Laboratories quite well. They talked, and he told my father he had a new product on his hands and he was into phase 3 testing and he needed a guinea pig. And he thought that this would stop my ankle from bleeding. And he asked my father if we were willing to do it. My father sat me down. We talked about it at length, both in the context of me individually and in the context of a quantum leap forward for hemophilia treatment. The day we went to Highland Laboratories, I'll never forget. There was a real sense of 1984, brave frontier, new world. It was a big event.
The trial drug became known as Factor Concentrate. It would literally change hemophiliacs' lives worldwide, allowing them to treat themselves quickly, easily, and at home.
I think there's no question that Factor Concentrates liberated most of us in my generation. We had a product that we could now travel with without carrying big boxes of dry ice. We had a product that was compact. We had a product where you could begin to control the amount of Factor VIII you were actually getting, which meant you could begin to have more control over bleeds, which allowed more activity.
Back in Wexford, John Scallon was something of a pioneer himself. In the late 1970s, he became one of the first people in Ireland to self-administer Factor Concentrate. It dramatically changed his life.
He was particularly courageous and spunky sort of person. And he said no, he would try. And even in the transfusion service, they called John Exhibit A because he did all the sorts of things that people said hemophiliacs couldn't do, from early days riding his bike and everything else. And he always was like that all his life. He'd say, I'll try it, and then if it works, other people can do it.
It just changed everyone's lives. These were, you hear of wonder drugs and you hear of penicillin coming in after the war. This was the penicillin to our family. And it was just so fabulous that suddenly his life was his life. More so, I think, with Factor VIII, because it really brought him into mainstream normal life.
The new drug meant a normal life too for future generations of haemophiliacs. When John Kelly was born in Dublin in 1981, there was no question of a childhood blighted by constant pain. Quite the opposite.
As a young baby, it made no difference to his life. As a young child, it made very, very little difference. We were advised, and I think rightly so, to make his life as normal as possible, to let him do everything. And in actual fact, we were advised sort of, rather than wrapping him in cotton wool, let him go out and take the knocks, and that they had the product there to, if he did have a bleed, to cope with that. We'd have to bring him into the hospital and he'd get a shot. He was very happy, jolly, wanted to be into everything. He was very popular on the road, he had loads of friends, and he was a normal, happy child.
But while Factor Concentrate was something of a wonder drug, there were also drawbacks. Each bottle was made from plasma collected from tens of thousands of donors. To make Factor Concentrate, the manufacturers needed a regular and very large supply of plasma. Fortunately for them, the United States had in place a system which encouraged mass donation. Many donors were paid. But donors weren't paid much, so those who donated needed the money the most. Viruses like hepatitis were more common among Skid Row donors, viruses which in turn could be passed on to haemophiliacs.
There were several reports that came with increasing frequency up till 1975, when the American Blood Commission issued a report that said we have to essentially stop paid donations for whole blood. But they made an exception for the concentrate manufacturers saying that this was necessary. It really wasn't necessary. It was just the cheapest way of proceeding.
So plasma for factor concentrates used by haemophiliacs continued to come from paid donors, as it seemed the benefits of the new product outweighed the risk of contracting hepatitis. Back in Ireland, the Blood Transfusion Service Board was aware of the dangers of using paid donors.
There are dangers inherent in the type of person who comes forward as a donor. Unhappily, you're apt too often to find that people such as drug addicts come forward. And these people, in some cases, have passed certain diseases from one to the other. A disease, for example, such as hepatitis, which is a form of jaundice. And obviously, these would not be suited to the blood transfusion services needs.
Despite these concerns, just months later the BTSB had changed its mind. It began importing and distributing American blood products, made in part using paid donors. There simply weren't enough donors sought or resources made available to make factor concentrate here. But in 1981 came a problem which couldn't be ignored: AIDS. In the United States, gay men were dying in numbers from this new disease which completely destroyed their immune system. It soon spread to intravenous drug abusers. When haemophiliacs were struck down, investigators here at the Centres for Disease Control believed they were dealing with a blood-borne agent.
Anytime you have a new epidemic, you try to fit the disease pattern you see to other diseases that are out there to help you guide us in the search for the cause. And this pattern started to look just like hepatitis B, that we knew that the gay men had increased rates of infection the more sexual partners they had. We knew the IV drug users were sharing blood with other IV drug users, and hemophiliacs are almost like the canary in the coal mine for blood transmissible agents.
CDC reported the first deaths in July of 1982. In LA, we saw the first cases in that period. Everybody got scared. No one knew what it meant. No one understood the magnitude. But it was just so frightening to everybody.
However, 1,600 miles away in Louisiana, James Fife, a severe haemophiliac, was blissfully unaware that he was at risk. He had every faith in the donors who helped make his factor.
Well, we were told that it was mostly medical students and just the general public. People volunteering to give blood. Civic-minded people that were trying to help and give plasma in order to manufacture the factor A.
Yet this wasn't always the case. Here in the deprived Watts district of Los Angeles, Arzina Robinson runs a shelter for homeless women and children. 14 years ago, Arzina won her own battle with drink and drugs.
I was homeless from the age of 9 until I was 28. I wound up on Skid Row and lived down there for 12 years. But I was comfortable. I didn't see anything wrong with the way I lived. I thought it was normal. In fact, I felt sorry for people who had places. I did. If a person had a house, I'd be like, well, you don't know what you're missing. At least I don't have to worry about anybody breaking into my house, stealing anything. Because I didn't have no house for them to break into. We used to hang at the corner of 6th in town. And it used to be a liquor store there. That's where a lot of us hung at. We used to drink and shoot dope and shoot pills. Sharing needles was fine. Rinsing it with water was fine. The only time we cleaned it with bleach was when the vein skin was stuck in it, it wouldn't run good. So we'd open it up like that. But we didn't know there was anything wrong with it. So yes, everybody shared needles. There was nothing wrong with it. I mean, we used as many new needles as we could, but you use a new needle and then someone else shares it. You know, it's 5 people can hit on one needle before it gets a little dull.
One favoured way to get money for drugs was to sell plasma at donor centres near Skid Row in downtown LA. Arzina didn't donate herself because she'd one time contracted syphilis, but all her friends were frequent donors.
My husband used to go to the blood bank over there, and a couple of friends used to go to the blood bank across the street. And the people would do plasma. I went in there a couple of times with them. They would have them laying there, and they would put the needles in them. They had this tubes going this way, like, I guess so they can drain the blood and I don't know. Because I'm a dolphin. I can tell you how to put it in me, but I didn't take it out. Most of us stayed high all night, so the next morning, when they went to the blood bank, it was just get the money to get high off of to stay high. So they already be high. And, you know, and I never thought about it then, I guess because I didn't care then because I was all right as far as I was concerned. But I know they can see the fresh needle marks. But they were getting what they wanted. They wanted the blood. Almost everybody I shot dope with or turned dates with has died from HIV or are dying from HIV, from AIDS. I am not surprised at all that the plasma and the blood turned out to be positive. I'm not surprised that a lot of hemophiliacs became positive because of the people that I knew and know that are dead or dying from AIDS. Because I know a lot of them and knew a lot of them that gave plasma.
This is Skid Row today in downtown Los Angeles. Once Arzina worked here as a prostitute. Now she's an outreach worker for other people who live on the streets.
Okay. Hey baby, how you doing? How you been, sweetheart? How you been? I ain't seen you in a long time. I know when I was drinking.
Angel is homeless and addicted to heroin. She claims she never shared needles and believes she got HIV from being stabbed with a bloody knife. Angel now has full-blown AIDS.
This is what we live like. I sleep around the corner on the street. I make a box house. I had a tent for a while. Somebody stole it. You know, it's hard out here. Being a single female, I gotta struggle to survive in order to make it because I don't have no male companion. This is my day-to-day life.
Before she was diagnosed with HIV, Angel regularly sold her plasma.
Every morning I wake up, I have to have a fix. I walk around the corner to the plasma center. I donate my blood, sick or not really caring. I just needed that fix money. I'm going to lay down on the table, let them draw my blood, take my plasma, rest, get up and come on out, go buy me a fix. At that time I was using the same vein where they was drawing the plasma from, so I didn't have scars on my arm, or I was shooting dope in my neck and wearing collars to hide the marks. You know, if they knew that you used drugs, they would refuse your plasma. All they want to know if you've been exposed to hepatitis or do you have TB, do you have hypertension. They have the questions to ask you, but it's up to you to answer them. It was never like you doing this interview with me. It was never a one-on-one situation. Because I'm not too good at lying, you know, so I'm glad they didn't ask me the questions one-on-one. It was always a paper interview. They was covering their tails. We went around it, you know. A drug addict is a manipulator. When they need that drug, you know what to do, you know what to say right then. Well, that's about it.
It wasn't just Skid Row donors who gave tainted blood during the AIDS crisis. Voluntary donations also carried risk. Some infections stemmed from volunteer donors throughout the United States. However, paid donors in hotspots posed a much higher risk. When word began to filter out that haemophiliacs were at risk, James Fife was reassured at his local Haemophilia Treatment Centre, or HTC, that he had nothing to worry about.
We began to hear things on the news, and one of the questions that I asked the nurse at the HTC, you know, about our concerns over the safety of the product, and she told me that I actually had a better chance of winning the Irish sweepstakes than picking up any sort of virus, AIDS or anything, from the factor concentrate. That made me feel pretty good because I didn't even know how to enter the Irish sweepstakes.
We were all pouring factor concentrates in our arms. The whole structure of hemophilia, once these products reached the market, was this is the panacea, used and used often. To think that this product could do that, potentially, nobody really knew yet, but to think that was overwhelming for most people because they had built their whole structure from 1974 on that this was the panacea. This was the silver bullet. This was liberation. How could something be wrong?
Back in Ireland, the AIDS crisis was viewed very much as an American problem. There were no cases here as yet, and the small haemophilia community and their doctors were relatively unconcerned. In Wexford, John Scallon was using the freedom which factor concentrate had afforded him to the maximum.
He was really living. He was getting on with his career, very successful in the business, seizing opportunities and generating more opportunities. Personally, John was doing well for himself. He was comfortable with a house when a lot of people his own age wouldn't have had a house. He had a terrific social life, was very heavily involved in the boat club, and that's the way John lived. He was a party animal. I suppose 83 I was aware of the worry about HIV. We as a family were aware of the possible risks because the blood products we knew were coming from the States. And at a later stage, John said to me, it's soon going to be manufactured in Ireland, and that's not going to be a problem then. But he was worried about it. It was very obvious he was worried about it.
It was at the back of our mind. It was a worry, but not a big worry. I think the figure was used 1,000,000 to 1 on one occasion that he would contract this from the products.
But by early 1983 at the CDC in Atlanta, there were very worrying signs that a huge number of people with haemophilia could be facing an uncertain future. There was no specific test for the virus as yet, but lab studies of haemophiliacs' immune systems showed an alarming rate of infection.
We saw that about 50% or more of the hemophiliacs who had been using factor concentrate had marked immunologic abnormalities. So one of the questions was it too late, even at that time? But it was clear that for the other half, something better be done. And for one half, they were in serious trouble.